Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick Hughes and I am Head of Export Trade Development for Potatoes at AHDB. I'd like to welcome you along to this webinar today entitled Potatoes and Brexit, What You Need to Know. During this session, we will offer information to prepare potato growers, importers and exporters for Brexit and offer insight into what lies ahead in a post-Brexit world. The webinar today will cover where we currently are in the Brexit transition process, a general overview of what the immediate impact of Brexit will be on the potato sector, and the knock-on effects of imports and exports for the seed and ware sectors. But first, to a bit of housekeeping. I'd like to remind everyone that the event will be recorded and links to the recording will be sent out after the webinar. Questions can be raised during the event using the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will address 1 to 2 questions after each presentation and then open up to a wider Q&A session after we have heard the final presentation. We will aim to address every question posed. However, if we aren't able to answer a question directly or we run out of time, we will endeavour to seek answers to the questions posted and circulate these after the event. So I'd like to introduce you to our panel of speakers for today. First up, we will hear from Alice Bailey from AHDB's Market Intelligence team. Alice is currently leading potato analysis for the MI team and is focusing on domestic potato supply chain analysis. Alice's experience in outlining the long-term challenges to potato supply and demand in domestic markets, and today we'll be setting the scene for the GB potato industry. Secondly, we will hear from Tania Gesto-Casas, who is AHDB's EU Policy Manager. Tania is currently on lockdown in Brussels and today will present on how the EU-UK trade negotiations are progressing. Our final presenter for today will be Sarah Baker, who is Senior Strategic Insight Manager at AHDB. Sarah is an experienced agricultural economist and strategy analyst and is currently engaged in the analysis of the impact of Brexit on UK farming. And today we'll focus on the UK potato trade post-Brexit. So just a final reminder that you can post questions at any point during the webinar using the control panel to the right of your screen. And without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to Alice to set the scene. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Hello and welcome everybody. I am Alice Bailey, as Patrick nicely introduced me. I'm Senior Analyst in the AHDB Potatoes team in the Market Intelligence Department. So I'm just going to set the scene a bit for us today before we move on to Tania and Sarah to go into some of the more technical aspects of it all. So if we could start off, please. Next slide. So having a look at the GB planted area for 2020, this is estimated for this season at 117,500 hectares, which is down 2.3% year on year. And as we can see from this graph, there are some differences between sectors. So the overall area is actually the 3rd lowest on record, but we've seen some rises in some sectors and some drops in other sectors. So this graph shows by sector the planted area. We've got 5 years worth of data, plus then the previous years, plus then the 2020 area, and then the 5-year average area in the hashed bars as well. So the second largest sector in terms of planted area is the processing sector, but this has seen quite a large fall year on year of 2,700 hectares. Now this equates to 7.1% drop year on year. We have actually lost 600 hectares of that process, or sort of that lost processing area from the northeast and northwest combined. Now these are regions that were hit quite badly from previous years of extreme weather events. And last year in particular, we saw some real struggles in the northwest. And as at the 12th of November, still 33% of the crop was still in the ground. So they did suffer quite badly. The processing sector is also one of the worst hit sectors by the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the coronavirus pandemic really hit the UK and had big effects on the UK right at the time of potato planting this season. And with a widespread loss of food service sector, this did hit processing. And as a result, we actually saw the contracted area also drop. I mean, we saw free buy drop as well, but the contracted area dropped to 2.3 thousand hectares, which is the equivalent of 6.5%. Now, on the other hand, we've actually seen the pre-pack, which is sort of almost in the middle there, the pre-pack sector, which had quite different effects from coronavirus. We saw an increase in the planted area. Like I said, it was quite a different story when coronavirus hit. We heard of a lot of panic buying, and we know that retail demand was really, really strong at the point of planting. And we've actually seen an increase in contracted area for the pre-pack market. And this does outweigh the small drop in free buy area for pre-pack market. So what does this mean in terms of production? If we could have the next slide, please. So for production, we're currently only partway through our lifting sort of season. There's still quite a lot of lifting going on, and as at the 20th of October, so that was a couple of weeks ago now, there was almost a quarter of the crop still in the ground. More lifting will have progressed since then, and we have our final lifting report out next week, which will show what progress has been made in that time. However, based on what was being lifted and what we've heard in the last couple of weeks, we're not expecting any massive bumper yields, and we're not expecting any detrimental yields either. There is a huge range between field and field or farm to farm. However, a lot of growers are saying that their yields are generally about on budget. So for this scenario, I've gone with a 5-year average yield, and we're looking at a crop between 5.2 and 5.4 million tonnes. I think it might have been cut off on your screen, but we've got two scenarios here, scenario A and scenario B. And the difference between these is that there's a 0% unharvested area in one of the estimates and a 3% unharvested area in the other. Now, to just put that into context, last year when we had the troubles with the flood, it was estimated that 6% of the total planted crop was not lifted, and it was abandoned in field or ploughed in. The year before that, it was less than 0.5%. So as a general rule, unless if there are extreme weather events like we saw in 2019, the entire crop will be lifted. It's just variable in terms of its yield or its quality, depending on what sort of conditions it's lifted in. We will inevitably see some variation between production between sectors, with an increase in planted area for packing and a drop in processing. We're likely to see a similar trend in terms of the overall production for these sectors as well. If I could have the next slide, please. So having a look at import and export trends is sort of the next key thing to note. So we have an idea of where we're going to be at with 2020 crop and production, but how important are import and exports to the UK? If I could have the next slide, please. We have a look at fresh ware trade first, and in terms of exports. So now, fresh ware trade, in terms of the HMRC commodity codes that we can pull information from, we know that this can exclude seed as that is on its own commodity code. However, this will include all packing potatoes, as well as potatoes destined for fresh chipping, and also processing potatoes just in their whole form before they're actually processed. Now this chart shows that this is the total freshware trade in terms of exports, and in the blue bars we've got how much of that goes to the EU, and in the green into non-EU. Now this graph starts at 90%, so it's clear to see here that it is really key, our EU market in terms of our exports for freshware trade. The market sector will differ depending on what the demand is elsewhere. So for example, in 2018-19, a lot of our fresh exports did include packing material, and a lot of our sort of undersized material that wasn't reaching spec in the UK was able to be utilised in an export market because of the strong demand seen in Eastern Europe. Some of our top destinations for our freshware trade exports include Spain, and within this, the Canary Islands will be included. We can't separate them out. But we know that especially at this time of year, a lot of our export trade in fresh form is actually over to the Canary Islands. This is slightly less affected at present anyway, because the Canaries work under their own sort of set of regulations compared to the rest of mainland Spain or the EU. Republic of Ireland is another key export destination for our ware trade, which I will come on to, and as is Belgium. It's likely that Belgian exports are going to be processing potatoes that will actually be processed once they reach Belgium. We generally fluctuate between being net importers and net exporters of fresh potatoes, but as a general, on an average, we are usually net exports of fresh ware potatoes. If I could have the next slide, please. If we now have a look at this on an import term, 66% of our imported fresh ware potatoes are from the EU. Now, this does vary from year to year, we can see on this graph, so this is now in actual terms rather than a percentage. We can see that the split between EU origin and non-EU origin does change from year to year. And in 2019-20, almost 80% of our imports actually came from the EU, compared to the average of 66. Now, despite 13% of our fresh exports being destined for Belgium, 19% of our fresh imports are actually coming from Belgium. So while we're talking about Belgium, it's probably time to start looking at the processing side of trade. Have the next slide, please. Having a look at frozen potato product imports. Now, top 5 origins, account for 99% of our trade, and almost 100% of our imports come from the EU. And quite clearly, it's Belgium and Netherlands that are really leading the way here. There is some questions that are raised from this on whether we could displace some of these imports, and could UK processors actually increase their throughput and utilise more domestic crop rather than exporting it to be processed, because we do know that some processing potatoes get exported and then they get re-imported in their processed form. So whether our factories could increase throughput and actually utilise that domestic crop and produce those frozen products in this country. In terms of frozen potato exports, again, the Republic of Ireland is one of our key destinations, with around 41% of our frozen export trade heading over to the Republic of Ireland. So I keep mentioning Ireland. I've mentioned it in the last couple of slides. So if we move on to look at that more specifically, if I could have the next slide, please. So having a look at the importance of Republic of Ireland and actually Northern Ireland. So this graph here represents our fresh exports, excluding seed, to the Republic of Ireland. So in blue, we've got exports to Ireland. In green, we've got the total exports. And then the yellow line indicates the percentage of our export trade and what percentage, Republic of Ireland actually makes up for us. We can see that it does vary from season to season, and it also varies throughout a season. However, it's quite clear that Ireland is important. And this graph only shows, because of the way HMRC data is, movement of potatoes from the UK to the Republic of Ireland. This doesn't include Northern Ireland, as this is obviously classed as the UK. And we know we export or we move product from mainland Great Britain over to Northern Ireland as well. Anecdotally, it's said that most of these potatoes, or a lot of these potatoes, are actually for the fresh chipping market rather than the packing market. Now, if, and yes, it is a big if, but if all of these exports were chipping potatoes and not packing potatoes, then that would be around 10% of our total production of fresh chipping potatoes in the UK in 2019-20 season were exported to the Republic of Ireland. And it's not just fresh exports that we send over there. I already mentioned that Ireland makes up a big chunk of our frozen exports. And we've actually not really seen a huge amount of front loading this season. So far, HMRC data only shows July and August. Next week, we should get September figures as well. But generally, we've only seen in those 2 months a 5% uplift from average in terms of our exports of frozen potato products. So we're not really seeing a big big push at the start of the season before the Brexit deadline. Similarly, we haven't seen a big increase in crisps that are moving over there either. The Republic of Ireland is another key destination for our exports of crisps, and 55% of our crisp exports do go to Ireland. And we've only seen 13% rise in exports in July and August, which wouldn't really show that we're massively front loading any exports before the Brexit deadline in those first couple of months. If I could have the next slide, please. So seed trade. Now, last but not least, for sure, is seed. All my previous slides have used HMRC data. However, there does seem to be some or under-reporting of seed imports into the UK through HMRC. There's a statutory requirement that anyone importing or any EU seed that is being imported into England and Wales must be registered with the Animal, Plant and Health Agency, or the APHA. So I've actually used their figures in terms of imports. Now, based on their figures, there's between 26 and 29,000 tonnes of seed has been imported each season over the last 2 years, and around 70% of this seed has come from the Netherlands. So we can really see that the importance of trade with the EU in terms of importing seed. In terms of exporting, on average, 71% of our seed exports are actually destined for non-EU countries, which might sound good news in terms of the fact that we will be leaving the EU. However, I think Tania or Sarah are going to cover this slightly, but we need our own agreements with these countries, so it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. And as you can see, that Egypt is one of our key export destinations, with nearly 50% of our seed exports heading over to Egypt. Next slide, please. So as a roundup of what I've just said, I know it's a quick whistle-stop tour to set the scene for the rest of the webinar, but in terms of the 2020 supply, we have seen an increased planted area of packing potatoes, and so we are likely to see an increase in production. We might have seen a bit of a drop in some of the other sectors, namely processing, but these other sectors have seen really subdued demand over the last few months since the coronavirus pandemic hit, with only really retail being the key driver of demand in the potato industry at the moment. For exports, we know that export trade is a key part of UK trade. We do importing and exporting, and export is important to us. And the Republic of Ireland is a top customer for fresh exports, but not just fresh, it is a top customer for our crisps and also our frozen potato products. For imports, we're a net importer of processed potato products, and that does pose the question of could we displace some of our imports? But as I've previously mentioned, we need to emphasise that this is only at the ability of factories being able to increase their throughput, but also their freezer space as well, to then hold all of that processed material and move it onto the market as and when demand is around. Thanks for listening.
That's great, Alice. Thank you very much indeed. We actually have a question in from one of our listeners, from James Wyatt. Maybe a point of clarification more than anything on the fresh potato exports. I take it most of the non-EU export is to the Canary Islands, or was that included in the EU figures because you couldn't split them from Spain?
Sorry, do you mean so all of our non-EU exports goes to the Canary Islands? Is that what you're saying? Sorry.
No, it was just a question. I think 97% of the exports was to the EU, but was the non-EU portion of that, would that be Canaries?
No, so the Canaries is actually classed as the EU because that actually comes under Spain.
Right.
The Canaries, our exports to the Canaries are actually deemed as going to Spain.
Great. Okay, thank you. Are we importing more frozen potato products into the UK over the last decade?
Yes, the sad and honest truth is yes, we are. So if we go back 10 years, then I think it's under, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's under 500,000 tonnes were generally being imported 10 years ago, whereas, as I mentioned, 660,000 tonnes were imported last season. And generally across those 10 years, we've gradually seen an increase of frozen imports. Now, it is likely that factories have been increasing their imports during, sorry, not their imports, their factories, their throughput during this time, but obviously not to the same extent that demand has been increasing. And actually, the HMRC data, and so the figures that I'm quoting of under 500,000 tonnes and 660,000 tonnes is the product weight. So if we then put a conversion factor on it and try and put this back to the raw equivalents as such, then it actually suggests that we might not actually be growing enough potatoes for that sector to actually be able to fully displace it, even if the factories had the ability to sort of process it all and store it all and move it onto the market gradually.
Okay. And finally, just before we move on to Tania, with a smaller area year on year being planted, why aren't the prices higher?
Yeah, I get that question a lot actually in my day job. But unfortunately, this year we've seen something we've never really experienced before, and that is really it's demand destruction. So usually we see low prices because of an oversupply, because we've had a bumper crop. So for example, in 2017, when we had a massive crop, we saw prices eroded away. However, this year it's been so different because, like I say, it's yes, essentially we have an oversupply, but that's actually more so because of demand destruction. From March, we saw a huge spike in the packing demand, as we know that panic buying in retailers was going on, and also people were buying potatoes at farm gate. But we saw the widespread closure of food service and those big key events not happening and that side of things as well. And so actually, it's that demand side of things that's keeping prices capped somewhat.
Okay, great. Well, listen, thank you very much. And you'll be joining us later for the panel question and answer session at the end. Yes. And without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Tania. And Tania is going to give us an update on how the UK and EU trade negotiations are progressing. So Tania, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Hello, everyone. So as Patrick said, I am the policy manager in the AHDB Brussels office, and today I'm going to provide a quick update on the state update of the EU-UK trade negotiations. So if we can move to the next slide, please. I'll start with a bit of background first. So as you'll probably remember, following the results of the 2016 Brexit referendum, the UK decided to leave the EU. And that triggered a quite unprecedented process of negotiations that was split in two phases. So in the first phase, the two sides had to focus on the separation issues, that is the terms and conditions for the UK exit from the EU. These negotiations took quite a while, but they finished when they managed to agree the withdrawal agreement, which is the legal text setting those terms and conditions for the UK exit. And this was agreed and then ratified. So the UK was able to actually leave the EU on the 31st of January 2020. This means that we are no longer a member state now, but we entered the transition period, which is a period during which the UK still has access to the single market and the customs. And once this first phase was over, we could focus the attention on the second phase, which is dealing with the future trade relationship. That is how the UK and the EU are going to trade with each other once the transition is over. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this second phase is where we are now. The goal of this second phase is to agree an EU-UK free trade agreement that needs to be in place, as I say, by the end of transition. And these negotiations started at the very beginning of March 2020, and obviously this beginning was really challenging, not only because of the difficulty of the negotiations themselves, but also because of the impact of the pandemic. But anyways, the negotiators managed to keep the negotiations going, and in total we've had 9 formal rounds of negotiations. And what progress have we made? Well, there has been progress, because there are some areas, core areas of trading goods and services mainly, where the interests of both sides are convergent. So progress was made on those areas. However, of course, there are still some very specific areas where substantial divergences remain. And I think I don't need to remind you all what these areas are, because you've probably heard about them in the news. But this is obviously, I'm speaking about fisheries, the level playing field issues, especially in the area of state aid, and also the governance of the future. So what are the latest developments? So a couple of weeks ago, you've probably seen a lot of news on the media, because there were indeed some statements from both sides, and for a while it looked like the negotiations were kind of over, but fortunately eventually the 2 negotiators decided that there's still hope for an agreement. So they came back to the negotiating table. The negotiations were in fact intensified. So they are now meeting every single day, weekends included. And the overall aim is to get an agreement by early November. So we have also the time for the ratification process, that it also takes some time. So the deal, with a view to have the deal in place by the end of the year. So next slide, please. Now, looking at seed and ware potato trade in particular, there's something we need to take into account, and that is that regardless of the outcome of the negotiations that I've just mentioned, there are some changes that will happen automatically and unavoidably by the end of the transition period, when the UK will no longer be part of the single market and the customs union. One of these automatic changes is that the UK will lose access for some agricultural products into the EU market. So there is, however, a way of regaining that access. There is a procedure, but it's a separate procedure. Like, strictly speaking, it's not part of the negotiations. It's just a separate procedure. So the outcome is somehow not dependent on the outcome of the trade negotiations. The first step of this procedure, as a first step in this procedure, the UK needs to be granted third country equivalence, and this is a technical issue, basically. It's based on plant health grounds, but it's worth noting that the requirements to get these third country equivalents are very strict, and this is reflected by the fact that there are very few countries in the world that have access to the EU market for potatoes. Like, for instance, for seed potatoes, only 1 country has access, and that's Switzerland. For ware potatoes, the list is slightly longer, but still, like, only some 11 countries in the whole world have access to the EU market. So the requirements are quite strict. And as I was saying earlier, this is a technical issue, but it's framed in a political context, right? And these days, there are loads of interests and loads of impacts that political decisions can have in areas which are, or in theory, should be strictly technical. And then, even if this third country equivalence is granted, it is worth noting that it's quite likely that after the transition period, additional requirements would be added to for UK potatoes going into the EU, such as phytosanitary certificates or additional testing or others. So what's the state of play of this separate procedure? Well, the UK authorities did submit an application to be granted this third country equivalence at the beginning of this year. However, and to our knowledge, this application has not progressed much so far. So this means it's now sitting in the EU Commission, but it hasn't been approved yet. So what this means in practice is, as things stand, the UK seed and ware potatoes cannot be exported to the EU as from the 1st of January 2020. And this has also repercussions on our trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because due to the Northern Ireland protocol, Northern Ireland has to apply some specific EU rules, especially EU rules regarding the EU single market. So because Northern Ireland has to apply some EU rules, that means that if we don't get access to the EU, we won't be able to send potatoes from GB to NI either. Oh, next slide, please. So as you can see, there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding the different aspects of trade with the EU after the transition period. However, there are a few things that we do know for sure. Like the first thing that we do know for sure is that time is extremely short, and the risk of no trade deal increases as the clock keeps ticking. So this is something we need to take into account, and we need to get ready for any outcome. Now, the second thing that we do know is that whatever happens, change is coming. As I said earlier, by the end of the transition period, the UK will no longer be part of the single market and will no longer be part of the customs union. And this will bring about unavoidable changes in the way we trade with the EU. And in this case, changes means additional barriers and disruption for trade. Now, even if a free trade agreement cannot replicate the benefits of being part of the single markets and the customs union, it is still a better option for everyone to have a trade deal in place for several reasons, but including the fact that a trade agreement, especially one that allows us to trade duty and quota free, is essential to remain competitive in the EU market. It can also help reducing the amount of regulatory barriers that we face. It cannot eliminate them. There will be some additional barriers, that's for sure. But, oh, I think my slides. Yeah, if we can go to the slide, please. Well, I'll continue. So, yeah, like a trade deal cannot eliminate all the barriers that we will be facing, but it can help, ease the process. And then having a trade deal in place is also key to ensure an efficient implementation of the protocol of Northern Ireland that we've mentioned earlier. However, there is one thing that a trade deal cannot ensure, and this is it can't guarantee that we get access to the EU market for seed and ware potato. As I said earlier, this is a separate procedure. It's all in a way interrelated, but it's a separate procedure. And as things stand at the moment, the UK won't be able to send seed or ware potato to the EU after the transition period. And this is all from me. So, I mean, if you have any questions, please feel free and to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Tania. Thank you very much indeed. That was very informative, and we have a lot of questions that are now coming in. Maybe we will work through them all, but as I said before, if there are any questions that we don't cover in the allocated time, we will answer them and we will circulate the answers after the event. Will organic products have access to Northern Ireland and to the EU after the end of the transition period, Tania?
Oh, that's a very good question, and there is still quite a lot of uncertainty around this area. So to be 100% honest, I can't not give the answer for sure, but this was indeed one of the areas where there has been more changes in trying to guarantee the access for the organic products once the transition is over.
Okay, not something more specific on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Are you aware if seed that has been imported from the UK into Northern Ireland before the 31st of December can be sold into the Republic of Ireland after the 1st of January?
That's quite specific indeed. I would recommend, in those specific cases to kind of check very carefully the UK government guidelines and also the EU notices for stakeholders, which are quite specific and cover these areas which are more niche. My understanding would be yes, because it is already in the Northern Ireland. If we have an agreement, then those products are already in the Northern Ireland market. So my understanding would be they can be traded, can be sent to the Republic of Ireland. But as I say, in those specific cases, it's worth just checking with the specific guidelines that both the EU and the UK government have on their websites.
Yeah, and we will also be asking these questions to DEFRA as well, who have agreed to sort of give us answers to the questions come from the webinar. So we will strive to get an answer for you. Just a final question, Tania, before we move on to Sarah. Does the third party or third country equivalents apply to Northern Ireland, given they remain part of the customs union post-Brexit?
Yeah, this is what I was, it's a bit what I was trying to explain. Indeed, because Northern Ireland, after the transition period, will be applying or enforcing some EU regulations, then it will mean that if we don't get the equivalence to send our potatoes to the EU, we won't be able to send our potatoes to Northern Ireland either.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Tania. And we will no doubt come back to some of these questions in the Q&A at the end. So our final speaker for today is Sarah Baker, and Sarah will be talking through about the impact on trade on the industry post-Brexit. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Patrick. Yes, I'm going to take you briefly through our analysis that we've done so far on trade in a post-Brexit scenario, and take you through the possible options with regard to no trade deal and a trade deal with the EU. Next slide, please. So as Alice said in much more detail than I will, but just a quick recap. At the moment, the broad picture is that the UK is a net importer of processed potato products, and we saw that they came predominantly from Belgium and the Netherlands, and it's a net exporter of seed potatoes, with a significant proportion of those going outside the EU, so to Egypt and Morocco. Next slide, please. If we look at those imports and exports now, I'm using HMRC data, and as Alice said, there are significant issues, particularly with the import volume on HMRC. But just to broadly paint this picture, you can see that we also import processed potatoes, and as Alice explained, some of those are on a carousel. So we're exporting some of our processing varieties across to the EU, and then importing them back as processed or semi-processed product. And the export market is predominantly fresh and seed as a rule, with processed potatoes growing in that capacity. Okay, next slide, please. If we look at the tariffs that the EU place on potato products, we can see immediately that in the event of no trade deal, there's an issue with our potatoes going across to the EU. So for frozen potatoes, it's 14%. pre-cooked frozen potatoes 14%, and the other frozen potato products 17.6%. Now that's quite a considerable margin on the existing situation. So you can see that we would face this high tariff barrier sending our products across to the EU. But equally now, in the light of the UK global tariff that was announced earlier this year, we will be putting up very similar size barriers. We've just rounded them very slightly, but we'll be putting up a similar barrier to any product coming in from the EU. So unless we have a continuity trade agreement with the country or a free trade agreement, we will be putting these tariffs on our imported potato products. So it was important for us that the modelling that we did at the beginning of this Brexit process that really looked at commodity prices and what would happen in various scenarios, that we updated that to reflect the UK global tariff. Next slide, please. And this is what our analysis shows. So in the event of an EU UK free trade agreement, you can see there's minimal change to the commodity prices, and there is still change. As Tania said, change is coming, and that change is inevitable as a result of additional trade frictions, those sanitary and phytosanitary checks at borders, the physical inspections, the documentation, and so on that is involved in trade once we're no longer part of that single market. But you can see in potatoes, they're in the region, they're less than 2%. It will vary according to if we're a net importer or a net exporter. If we're a net importer, that trade friction means that there's a sort of an upward pressure on prices, and vice versa if we're a net exporter. The 2019, there was a range of tariffs announced that basically gave minimal protection to UK agricultural produce in the spirit of this great trading nation that the UK is aspiring to become post-Brexit. And we saw then that there was a small increase in the price of potatoes. But under the more protectionist UK global tariff, you can see a big jump, so it's up almost 17% in the price of potatoes. Now this is really important because it's an average, and as we all know, those distinct markets, the ware, the pre-packed, the seed and the processed potatoes are very different. So this modelling gives an overall picture, if you like, of the opportunity for potatoes as a whole. Next slide, please. In reality, the impact will vary very much by sector. So as we can see, the processing varieties have the greatest opportunity. So if we could displace some of that frozen processed product, as Alice said, if there was the capacity in the UK, we're still not growing enough processing processing potatoes to satisfy demand. So there is a significant opportunity there in the event of no trade deal for those processing varieties to displace some of that imported product that will be facing those relatively high tariffs coming in from Belgium and the Netherlands. Also, that the opportunity for seed potatoes, we're a net exporter of seed potatoes to the EU, Morocco and Egypt. And is there a potential to expand this trade? Well, that's interesting. The tariffs on seed potatoes are nowhere near as high. They're between 2% and 4%. So again, we could see significant opportunities to expand the export of seeds. So the displacement of the processing varieties coming in and the expansion of our seed exports could both provide significant opportunities in this sector. It is quite positive actually to talk to you for once about opportunities within a sector, because we all know not all sectors are facing these positive situations. Next slide, please. The issue with exporting potatoes post-Brexit, well, really, it's the rate of exchange plus the tariffs. Is it viable to export? Are we going to be competitive? If we face the tariff going into the EU, they will probably source a lot of their potatoes from elsewhere. If, however, we strike a trade deal, then there's no reason why we couldn't continue to trade with them. But if we don't strike a trade deal, we have that opportunity for displacement of the processed varieties. We've yet to agree a continuity agreement with Egypt for the seed potatoes. That is important, although the tariff is relatively low compared to the processed potatoes. It is still important that we get that continuity agreement. We have struck one with Morocco, and I know work is ongoing with Egypt to reach that agreement before we exit the transition period. Next slide, please. I think my slides are slightly stuck. Okay, so the take-home point, and this is really important, the impact of no deal varies hugely by depending on which sector, what type of potatoes you're growing, seed, ware or processed. And obviously not all geographical locations are suited to grow all varieties of potatoes. So the impact and the potential opportunities and threats will vary hugely by location. And individual businesses are best placed to understand how they might be affected by no deal. But the overall message from what Tania said and from what Alice said is that you need to prepare your businesses for no deal now. The clock is ticking, negotiations are intensifying, but time is running out. And we would strongly urge you to prepare for no deal now, because then if a deal is struck, at least you have been well prepared for every eventuality. Read those detailed notices. Some of the questions coming in today on the technical nature, I think, reflects the frustration that many of our levy payers feel with the lack of information. We're only sort of 8 weeks away from the end of the transition, and there's so many questions unanswered because of this extension in the negotiations, and therefore it's important to prepare your business as well as you can with the information that is available out there. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's probably a range of questions around Brexit and the modelling work and so on that you can ask me in and around potatoes and the other sectors. So I'm happy to answer any questions coming my way. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Sarah. I have a question more related to tariffs than anything else, but how can importers and exporters keep up to date with the latest tariff arrangements? I mean, what would you recommend sort of to keep tabs on things?
Right, okay, if they go to the AHDB website and search for UK global tariff, we've got all the tariff lines up there with the rate published against them, so they can query any individual tariff line. In addition, that's also available on gov.uk. So those tariff lines, if they search UK global tariff, UK GT, they can look up individual tariff lines and keep abreast of those. The only things that are going to change between that and the 31st of December are if any more of the continuity agreement deals are struck between then and now. So again, those pages will be updated as soon as possible, but that's the only possible thing that can change between then and now. But they're broadly the same as the EU common external tariff, with just some rounding and some small percentages taken down, generally rounded down slightly, 1 or 2%.
Okay, great. Well, what I'll do at this stage is, and I'll invite all our panelists back in. And because maybe, Sarah, there's a couple of questions that maybe you're best placed to answer, or maybe Tania. So I'll crack on because there are quite a few that are now coming in. So we've got a couple of questions from Archie Gibson. Question to Tania. Thank you for your presentation. As the UK does not have bilateral agreements with North African and Middle Eastern countries, and future supply in the absence of a third country agreement is in doubt, will the trade to the Canaries be similarly impacted in the event of a no deal?
The trade to the Canary Islands. Well, as Alice explained, the Canary Islands, in terms of plant health, are considered as a third country. However, they are indeed part of the EU. So it's a slightly tricky situation there, and there will be the UK will need to do a process to get access as well, but it's slightly different than the rest of the EU. So there will be some impact, I think, but yeah, it's it's worth checking what the process will be for the Canary Islands specifically, because they are in a very special situation.
Okay, thank you. In regards to trade with Northern Ireland, GB suppliers will be banned from supplying this market and the Republic of Ireland in the event of a no deal. If the UK authorities agree to provide phytosanitary certificates with all certified seed trades, then since we have harmonised arrangements for the moment, well, basically Archie's wondering, has this been politicised? The fact that we haven't got a third country equivalence, is it all wrapped up in the negotiation for a deal and a no deal?
I mean, in a way, as I was saying in my presentation, it is a technical procedure because it's based on, plant health criteria, but I would say it is somehow politicized because there are some interests, and in this context where we are trying to agree this deal, obviously each side is trying to keep their own resources or leverage for the negotiations where it can. So yeah, to my understanding is that it is kind of this application is sitting on the European Commission, but it hasn't processed, it hasn't advanced yet because they are waiting to see what the results of the trade deal are, and based on that they may take one decision or the other.
So we haven't received third country equivalents for potatoes yet, Tania, but is this the same for other products, such as animal origins, for example?
Yes, it is the same for other products as well. There might be some confusion here because it is true that animal products, the same as potatoes, will need to go through a process to get access to the EU market after the transition period. What happened is in 2019, before in the prior Brexit date, which was when Brexit was supposed to happen in October 2019, the EU did agree to include the UK in the list of countries that can export products of animal origin for the EU. What happened then was, given that the exit day was postponed to January, this approval never entered into force. And now that we are in the transition period, this approval needs to go again through the listing needs to go again through the process of approval. So at the time being, the products of animal origin are in the same situation as the potatoes. But with the only difference that for what we've heard from DEFRA, the vote for the products of animal origin authorization, so to say, is in principle planned to happen in December, whereas for potatoes, we haven't heard of any plans yet.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, a quick question for you. If the EU will grant equivalence to the UK, will it cover the whole country or will it just be England and Wales?
It should cover the whole country. I think that's well understood, and that was part of the thinking behind the internal market bill, that the UK operates as one entity with regard to trade and equivalence, and therefore it will be granted to the whole of the UK. That is my understanding.
Okay, thank you. Alice, another question for you. If irrespective of a trade deal, is there any value in the UK exporting more potatoes, or should we concentrate on fulfilling domestic demand? Sarah touched on that a bit in her presentation.
Yeah, and there is definitely potential for us to utilise our domestic crop better, and especially more so, both myself and Sarah touched upon it, about the frozen market. However, it does come down to the capacity of factories. Like I said, they would need to increase their throughput, and how easy that is and how much development those factories would actually need to do that. Then they also need to ensure we've actually got the freezer space once it's been processed. For other sectors, it's not quite as simple as that. I mean, it varies by sector, but for example, for the packing sector, and I touched upon it about our 2018-19 exports, it's not just about us utilising, we'd need to change our specs. So yes, we still had a packing market with good demand in 2018-19 season. But the reason we had such high exports was because of the season that we'd had. We had a lot of undersized potatoes, and we were actually able, they were actually deemed as waste in our UK market, but we could utilise that crop by actually putting it into Eastern Europe where the specifications were different. So then it would be a case of trying to push forward on adaptations to specifications, I suppose, in those sorts of situations.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, maybe you could answer this one. It's from Mike Abram. What kind of things would you advise farmers to do to prepare for no deal?
That's a really cracking question. In the current climate of uncertainty, what farmers can actually do in order to prepare is really challenging, and the tendency is to wait and see, is to wait for more information. But what we would say here at AHDB is that wait and see is a high risk strategy. They need to prepare their businesses for the event of no deal, and to do that, there's a wealth of information available on our website, but really is the two things that I would point them towards are the characteristics of top performing farms. So our analysis shows very clearly that the top 25% in any sector, and that includes potatoes, will remain profitable even under the most challenging of scenarios. So what is it that those growers are doing that differs from the rest of the sector? Have a look at that document, because it very clearly states that a lot of those key influences to performance are within the individual farmer's gift. They're not necessarily related to scale, location, and so on. They really are within the individual farmer's gift to address. The other thing that I would do is to really understand the market, speak to your buyer, know your customer, know the market trends. As Alice and I have touched on, this opportunity for processed and so on, whatever sector you're in, understand the trends, understand where your product is going, and understand what the challenges will be from the 1st of January, because if you're prepared, that gives you more time to react and make contingency plans. If you're going to need to talk to your bank manager with regard to finance, speak to him now, not on the 1st of January, because the earlier you can prepare extra borrowing capacity, the more favourably probably you will be looked upon. The other thing is to explore the new domestic agricultural policy. I know potato growers aren't necessarily hugely dependent on direct payments, but look at what is available through the pilot scheme in Elm, and look at if there are opportunities for your sector in there that you can look at more long term. The other thing that I would suggest in this sector is the possibility of managing your overheads. We all know that potato growing requires highly specialist machinery. It's incredibly expensive. Is there an option to machinery share? Is there an option to buy in a partnership? They're the few things that I would think about. But visit our website, because there is a huge amount of information on there that we've been working on over the last 4 years, really, to help prepare our levy payers for the challenges that are coming up.
So there's an element there of looking at your supply chain and sort of from going up the way and down the way, and looking at the pinch points and trying to understand where the potential pitfalls may be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, not just where you're selling your product to, which is incredibly important, but again, touching on machinery, where are those spares going to come from if we haven't got a free trade agreement with the EU? At the moment, you can ring up a parts manufacturer and they'll stick it on a courier and it can be with you in a matter of hours. Is that going to change? And with your other inputs, are they significantly? What are the tariffs on those? Are they imported? What's it going to cost you? The actives available, all those sorts of things. Understand that, be prepared for it. And then if we get a deal with the EU and it is as near as possible business as usual, then you haven't lost anything. You are just better prepared, if you like, and particularly if you look at the characteristics of top performing farms, all you'll have is a more profitable business. But if you do wait and see, you will be playing catch up, and I think that will be a dangerous place to be, because we haven't even mentioned COVID yet, but with the challenges with Brexit, well, leaving the EU, the end of the transition, and COVID combined, it is going to be an incredibly challenging time for UK agriculture.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Tania, there's a question from James Bulford. If there's a trade agreement reached between the UK and the EU, does the EU still have to approve UK phytosanitary equivalents before cross-border trade can start again?
Yes, it's as I said, it's a separate process. Obviously now we're in this political context, but in nature it's a separate process. One thing is getting access to the market. The other thing is then the conditions that we can agree on the trade agreement regarding tariffs, quotas, and so on. But yes, we still need to go through the third country equivalence process to get access to the EU market.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, maybe a question for you. It's quite a technical one, and bear with me, it's from Mary Young. Would a tariff be applied to export potatoes to the EU, processed, and then another tariff applied for importing the frozen processed potatoes back to the UK?
Yes, in the event of no trade deal, that's exactly what will happen. So you can see that it would stop that carousel trade in its tracks, really, because that's not viable to pay a tariff, both when sending the processed variety out and then buying it back in. So yeah, absolutely. Just the fact that it is going to come back to us doesn't mean that it's exempt from those tariffs. So that is really where the opportunity lies, because that tariff is magnified, if you like. You're not exactly doubling it, because the tariffs on the fresh potatoes aren't exactly the same, but you are magnifying it by sending it out and then importing it back in.
Okay, thank you. And Tania, just a point of clarification, mainly that obviously we are fighting for equivalence and seeking equivalence from the UK side to the EU, but we've got counterparts in the EU that are actually fighting for equivalence as well through the likes of Europetat. Would that be correct?
Do you mean fighting for equivalence from the UK to the EU?
Well, trying to get third country equivalents for the UK to try and seek third country equivalents. We've got counterparts in Europe that are seeking the same thing.
Oh yes, Europetat is the well, my colleagues in the Europetat hopefully forgive me because I don't know exactly the full name, but it's basically the trade association for potatoes, the European Association of Trade. Bodies for potatoes, basically, and they have UK members as well, and they've been since the beginning of this, like, in contact with the European Commission to kind of push this dossier. I've been obviously in touch with colleagues in Europe that they've been of great help clarifying issues, because obviously as a UK stakeholder, our access to the European Commission is being restricted now. We are no longer a new member, so and this is a quite sensitive negotiation. So it's not that easy for a UK stakeholder to get access to some information. So colleagues in Europe that have been pushing this dossier for us and have been very helpful indeed, trying to keep us updated on this. So my official thanks for them here now in front of everyone.
Thank you. Maybe Sarah, one for you from Mary Young again. Is there an expectation for the growers to arrange a phytosanitary certificate to be completed, or would it be the customer?
No, there's a good question. I'm not 100% certain on that. Tania, are you clearer on that? Is it the grower? I think it's the grower, isn't it, that has to get the certification before they leave the UK in order for them to be exported.
Patrick, can you repeat the question, because I couldn't hear it properly?
Is there an expectation for the growers to arrange for phytosanitary certification to be completed, or would it be the customer?
That's a good question. I don't know for sure. I think it should be the grower, right? But,
yeah, but it's one of these questions that we will get clarification for and send round at a later
Yeah,
yeah.
As a plant product, Patrick, it's up to whoever is selling it. So be it if it's a direct sale from the grower, then the grower, but if it's going through a merchant who's exporting, then it would be the merchant that would deal with the phytosanitary certificate, but it would be from the UK side for sure, rather than that customer the other side of wherever it's going. But yes, we will get clarification on that.
I've just got clarification that it is the exporter who has to apply for the phyto certification. So thank you to Gary Bradbury for that clarification. And Archie Gibson, who said it's down to the trader and the supplier. So just a couple of quick questions, Tania. I think for you, we've heard Prime Minister Boris Johnson talk about deadlines and had a set the 15th of October as a deadline. We then had the EU setting a deadline of the 30th of October. Both of these dates have now passed. So is a deal still possible?
Yes, it is still possible. And the negotiators are in fact now intensifying negotiations. They are meeting, I said in the presentation, daily, like weekends included, and that's because they believe a deal is still possible. Of course, now the challenge is the ratification as well, because that also needs time. It's a process that needs time, and it requires the agreement, the unanimous approval from all member states. So it can be a challenging process. We shouldn't underestimate either this ratification part. We've seen it with the withdrawal agreement, how the ratification part can be the trickiest part, and so we still need to go through that. But a deal is still possible. The sticking points, to my knowledge, the sticking points remain the same, but I've seen a lot of speculation regarding potential solutions. So hopefully in the coming weeks, because it's clear that we are now in the end game phase, so in the next couple of weeks, we'll know whether there's a deal or not, and then they'll have to really speed up things, but they'll have some time for the ratification, so the deal can be in place by the end of the year when the transition is over.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not seeing any more questions coming through. And we're pretty much near the end of our session anyway. So all it really takes for me is to thank all the speakers for their time today and for their input. Very, very meaningful input and some good questions that I think you answered admirably. So thank you very much for that. David, I think we've got another slide. Yes, so we've created a Brexit countdown document that's specific to potatoes. We've already issued one. There will be other issues going out in November and December. And if you would like to get onto the circulation list for that countdown document, if you could please contact my colleague Mike Skinner at margaret.skinner@ahdb.org.uk. Then Margaret will add you to the circulation list, and we'll make sure that you're not missed out. And again, we've had some technical questions that were asked today, and that we will endeavour to seek answers, and we will circulate those answers around the group today. Next slide, please, David. So for future events, we've got another webinar tomorrow. The webinar tomorrow is exploring the impact of no deal. We're going to hear from a business, an exporting business, in terms of the preparations that they're taking. We'll hear from the NFU, and we'll also hear the immediate steps that businesses need to take in the before the end of the transition period. There's also another Brexit webinar called Leaving the EU. Change is coming on the 12th of November. And on the 24th of November, we have the Potato Industry Conference, which is a one-day conference, again, sort of a virtual conference. But for more information, for booking details, and actually to explore any previous webinars that have already been carried out, and you can watch recordings if you visit the ahdb.org.uk website, and it's the events page. Yeah, that's us coming to the end. You'll shortly receive a feedback form, and we would really appreciate you take your time to complete that. It is a very, very short feedback form, but all comments are greatly received, and it helps us to refine these webinars and help to actually sort of determine the topics that we cover. Somebody did mention in one of the questions that it might be sensible to schedule another webinar later in mid-December based on the current uncertainty. We'll certainly look at that. If that's possible, we will look at that. If not, we will make sure that we do get as much information out there as possible, possibly in another countdown document or something like that. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I hope that was worthwhile. Please come back tomorrow to hear from a business perspective, a bit more planning on what steps you need to take. And thank you very much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.